There are few things more heartbreaking than the loss of a young person, or having to look into the eyes of a family and explain to them that their child has been lost, and especially a child that was so young. This is especially heartbreaking. This type of loss is especially heartbreaking when you look at Mr. Ruffin's age, coupled with the fact that his life was lost at the hands of law enforcement. This narrative tragically fits right into the social commentary as we read another young black male dead at the hands of police, a white police officer at that. It's heartbreaking because America has a long history of mistreatment of people of color, a dark past that includes social, economic, and legal injustices that many of our parents and grandparents have had to endure. All of us in this very courtroom have read about it. Some of us have actually experienced it, and some of us may still experience it. This is an inglorious history that has shamefully subjugated an entire segment of our population, often under the color of law. It's an inglorious history that even now gives many peoples of color an inherent mistrust of government, an inherent mistrust of law enforcement, and an inherent mistrust of prosecutors. It's an inherent mistrust that unfortunately was earned. As your Fifth Circuit solicitor, I bear that burden. My office bears that burden. But we also bear the promise of tomorrow. We bear the promise of the opportunities that our foreparents may have only dreamt of. Positions of influence that afford us the opportunities to make decisions and create policies that affect positive change. I'm a product of that change, a product of mothers and fathers who saw and who prayed and saw change. I'm a graduate of Dreher High School, a graduate of the College of Charleston, a graduate of the University of South Carolina School of Law, and I've practiced law in this community for the last 2 decades. I've seen change, but there is still much that needs to be done. We are the living promise of their faith, of your faith, and of our faith. And we are the living promise of our state's creed, Dum Spiro Spero, that while I breathe, I hope. While I breathe, I'm hoping that this office's action, coupled with its mission to serve as ministers of justice in the fair and diligent prosecution of defendants charged with criminal offenses, will always be the forefront of our minds as we endeavor to break this cycle of mistrust through positive community engagement, through transparency, and through fair prosecution. I stand with my office during these tumultuous times, knowing that each of them has pledged to serve this community. Each of them has pledged to serve this city, and each of them has pledged to serve this state as we work to propel Columbia into the 21st century by embracing the promise of our collective present and our collective future. They understand, as I told them back on January 9th, 2019, when I took office, that we will seek justice no matter how well she may hide herself. They understand that when I told our communities that justice requires all of us to take ownership and be willing to hold those accountable who break the law, no matter who they may be. They understand that when I told law enforcement that justice means being fair to all of our citizens all of the time, and that they would be equipped with the knowledge that when they do the right thing, the communities will have their back, and this office, the Fifth Circuit Solicitor's Office, will have their back. Folks, today is one of those times. Over the next 25 minutes or so, I'll share details about SLED's independent investigation of the Ruffin Davis officer-involved shooting, including the body-worn camera, including the law that governs these matters, and lastly, our independent review of the investigation that was done by SLED. So let's focus briefly on August of 2016. The city of Columbia, after Chief Holbrook came into office, I believe in 2014, began moving towards community policing. A lot of the things that you've heard about in the media about law enforcement presence in communities, those things were being put into place by the City of Columbia even back in 2014. I'm just bringing to your attention the preamble to one of the policies that reads here, and I'll read it, it'll be hard for you to see. It says that each officer has a responsibility to know the identities of as many individuals in his patrol area as possible. The officer has the responsibility to develop knowledge of legitimate or illegitimate activity in their assigned area. The field interview process is a method that an officer may use to learn the nature and character of individuals that he encounters. Folks, that's what's called community policing. And that's the policy that was in place on April 8, 2020, when this incident took place. Just a brief backdrop. Officer Kevin Davis, who had been with the City of Columbia for at least 4.5 years as a community police officer in the North region where this incident took place, received a text message from one of the community presidents. That message suggested, it didn't suggest, that message actually said, and what I'm doing here is focusing you in on the Seminary Ridge community, which is in North Columbia. That message explained that there had been teenagers riding through the community on bikes, messing with cars. After receiving that text message, Mr. Davis rode over to the community, which he does every day. And as he rode through the community, he started to look to see if he could see any evidence of that taking place. As he came up Sycamore Avenue, which is here, you'll have another opportunity to actually see that little highlight. As he came across Sycamore Avenue and intersected close to on Arlington and Timrod, which is right here. And again, we'll slow down and allow you to see that again. He first came into contact with Mr. Ruffin. The evidence that we've reviewed suggests that once he came in contact with Mr. Ruffin essentially saw that he was in a marked patrol car and tried to move quickly behind the house. As he did that caught the officer's attention. When Mr. Ruffin came to the other side of the house at some point, the officer then noticed a large computer-style bag on his hip that he didn't see when he first came in contact with him. At that point, Officer Davis attempted to engage him in conversation. Again, he was in his clearly marked Columbia Police Department car, and he was clearly dressed in his Columbia Police Department uniform. At that point, Mr. Ruffin walked faster and eventually started to run from him. At that point, Officer Davis stepped outside of the car and began to pursue him on foot. His body camera activated at that point in time, which you will see in a few minutes. He pursued him, continuing to say, "Stop running, stop running, stop running." But Mr. Ruffin continued to run. He also relayed back through his radio that he could see Mr. Ruffin messing or bothering the waistband of his pants. That is one of those cues that officers see that suggest that there's something in the pants that a person is trying to secure or keep from falling. As they came down Arlington Street and took a right onto Columbia College Drive, they ended up stopping very close to this area, which is the edge of Eau Claire High School. At that point, Mr. Ruffin reached down and at some point secured a .45 caliber handgun. And as he secured that handgun, looked towards the officer, pointing it in his direction. And at that point, Officer Davis fired several rounds. Eventually, he struck Mr. Ruffin in the forehead, and that gunshot wound led to his death. SLED was called immediately by Chief Holbrook to come in and do an independent investigation, because that's the relationship that is in place between SLED and Columbia Police Department. In officer-involved shootings, SLED comes and investigates. They are an independent entity, and they investigate when they're called on to do so. They came in and they were on boots on the ground in this neighborhood within 1 hour of the shooting taking place. We'll talk a little bit about the investigation that they did. But SLED did its investigation. They interviewed witnesses. They reviewed body cam. They submitted evidence for forensic evidence, pathologists. They did an extensive investigation. They handed that investigation over to this office at the end of May. My office reviewed the investigation that they did so that we could look at the legal theories behind all of the things that took place. And so based on the investigation, the independent investigation that SLED did, my office again reviewed that finding. And we determined that a legal analysis needed to be done. The legal analysis is, number one, did Officer Davis have a reasonable suspicion that Mr. Ruffin was involved in criminal activity? And two, was Officer Davis justified in using deadly force during his encounter with Mr. Ruffin? Now again, as we talk about what happens with the legal analysis, we have to analyze these matters under the terms of reasonable suspicion. So again, did the officer have reasonable suspicion when he first encountered Mr. Davis? Reasonable suspicion is relatively simple. It requires more than just having a hunch like you used to see in some of these old movies. You know, the officer had a hunch that something was happening or the hair stood up on the back of his neck. That's not a reasonable suspicion. You have to have some type of particularized information that you can articulate as to why you are making particular moves or having particular actions. That's what reasonable suspicion requires. And so the first question again, was there reasonable suspicion? We can look at particularized instances, things that are particular facts that are placed out there, which we will discuss in a couple moments. But you can also look at the totality of the circumstances, which is again what the courts in South Carolina talk about. When you say the totality of the circumstances, what that means is, are there additional factors that were going on at the time that the officer relied on in order to make the decisions that he or she made when they encountered a suspect. So I'm going to list for you several factors that we believe are the reasonable suspicion that existed when Officer Davis came into contact with Mr. Ruffin. First, there's a text message from the neighborhood president that talked about potential break-ins in the area. That's the first factor. Second, there was Officer Davis's knowledge that car break-ins had occurred in the neighborhood next door to Seminary Ridge the night before. Third, there's the frequency of property crimes and car break-ins that are taking place in Columbia. I'll go through some statistics with you about that in just a moment. Fourth, the frequency of violent crime in the North region. Fifth, the stay-at-home orders that were in place from both Mayor Benjamin and Governor McMaster that were in place on April 8th, 2020, when this incident occurred. And lastly, Mr. Ruffin's actions when he encountered Officer Davis. So we'll go through each one of these things individually. So let's begin with the text message. As I mentioned to you a moment ago, there's a text message that was received from the president of the Seminary Ridge Neighborhood Association at 6 p.m. He directly sent a text message to Officer Davis, who was the community officer. Again, that's important because Officer Davis spent years in that community, developing relationships, meeting the presidents, meeting the people in the community. And so when things took place, or there were questions about what was going on, people in the neighborhood would directly contact Officer Davis as he was that officer. There was a text message that was received at 6 p.m. And that message mentioned that there are teenagers on bicycles in Seminary Ridge looking in cars. A resident on Sycamore Avenue, which I pointed to you earlier, and I'll show you again in a moment, said that she caught them messing with her car. And again, I told you about the contact that the neighborhood president already had with Officer Davis, so I'll go directly to the text message. And I'll read it just in case you're not able to see it. Starting here at 1800 hours, which of course is 6 o'clock. It says, hope you're doing well. I know you guys have a lot going on, but wanted to let you know that there's a group of teenagers riding their bikes through Seminary Ridge looking in cars. We've reminded people to lock their doors, of course, just putting in on your radar. Question from Officer Davis, Is this happening now? Answer, yes, a neighbor caught them messing with her car today. Answer, okay, we will go right around and try to find her. Do you have her number? Answer, I don't. She lives on Sycamore. Again, that is a direct text message that was sent to the community officer about what was going on contemporaneously. This is Sycamore Avenue, highlighted here. So as you'll see, I'm going to walk around. It is 2 blocks from Eau Claire High School, where ultimately the shooting took place. It's 1 block from Timrod Street, which is where the initial contact between Officer Davis and Mr. Ruffin took place. This is just an overhead view of Arlington Street going into Columbia College Drive, and the area again where the incident took place. Now let's talk about recent break-ins. The evening before, there had been break-ins of cars in the community next door to Seminary Ridge. So you may ask, why is that important? That's important because as we reviewed the independent investigation that SLED did, we learned that every evening, at every shift change, whether it's morning or evening, there's a meeting between the officers who are changing shift and the shift supervisor. That shift supervisor talks about criminals, talks about statistics of things that have happened the evening before or the morning before. They talk about things to be of concern. They talk about any particular orders that are out there, and they just talk about what's happened. You've seen that on some shows before where they all sit in a room and talk about what happens. That's real. That actually takes place. That's data that is shared with shift supervisors that comes from up top, and they start to learn what's going on and things they need to be on the lookout for as they're patrolling. They learned about these break-ins that had happened next door. Excuse me, I say in the next door community. And they also knew that they needed to be on the lookout for things of that nature that were taking place. At these meetings, they also learned about the frequency of property crimes that are taking place in Columbia. I'll show you a graph in just a moment that talks about how Columbia rates nationally with the property crimes and auto break-in and things of that nature that are taking place. What you'll learn is that property crimes are more prevalent in Columbia than other cities that are similarly situated in size, meaning between 100,000 and 250,000 residents. You'll find that Columbia rates higher than all of them. You'll find that we're well above the state average and well above the national average. Again, that's information that is passed on to officers on a daily basis so that they know what to be on the lookout for. We'll talk about the North region that has a higher rate of auto break-ins. Again, that's information that Officer Davis was aware of as he took his shift that particular day as he rode out to Seminary Ridge on April 8th, 2020. He's aware that when auto break-ins take place, because they happen at a greater rate in the North region, oftentimes people will stash the things that they steal behind homes, behind shrubs, behind sheds, and come back and get it at a later time. That's information that's shared with him at these types of meetings. He's aware that guns are seized in the North region at a higher rate than anywhere else in the city of Columbia. Again, information that he's aware of. Information that he's aware of when this stop actually took place. So let's look at this metric we talked about property crimes. The blue line here is Columbia. These metrics were taken from 2008 to 2018. Columbia is at on a higher clip as property crimes per 100,000 residents. So again, here we are. The state of South Carolina, which is in red, we're higher than the state average in Columbia. The United States of the national rate, we're higher, which is the green line, we're higher here in Columbia. Cities with 100,000 to 250,000 people, we're higher. That's the purple line. So again, that's information that this officer is equipped with when he goes on duty every day. This next metric that I'm showing you is talks about auto break-ins. See these concentric circles here that are shown. The actual yellow dot in the middle at the center of both of these circles, that's where the incident here took place. So if we look at this yellow circle, the first one, the smaller of the two, that's a half-mile radius from where the officer-involved shooting took took place. Each of these dots is an auto break-in that took place within a half-mile radius of where the actual officer-involved shooting took place. You go out another half mile. Again, each one of these dots is an auto break-in that took place in those areas. So within a mile radius, you have all those auto break-ins that have taken place. And that's just in a mile radius of the area of seminary areas that we're talking about. If you look at the blue region that's highlighted, that's the North region. These are metrics that have been taking place between 2015 through June 5th of this year. Gun seized. We talked about violent crime, violent crime issues. Green is the North region. So from 2015, there were 145 guns seized, 122 in 2016, 183 in 2017, 224 in 2018. 370 guns were seized in the North region last year. And year to date, up until June 5th, 2 weeks ago, this year, 121. Now, as you may know, there's a fatality in the North region over this weekend, so we expect that number has risen even since this measure was done. Violent crime. The frequency of violent crime in the North region is higher than any other region in Columbia. It's higher than any other region. Person hit shootings, again in green. The North region leads every other region in Columbia. So going to 2018, there were 37, 46 last year, and 20 this year, up until June 5th of this year. Again, with the fatality that took place this past weekend, that number is now higher. Again, this is information that Officer Davis and every other officer who works in the North region or who works in the city of Columbia is aware of. They're aware of the particularized numbers for each region they work in. But we're talking about the North region was aware because they meet and they talk about these metrics on a daily basis. So you may ask me, why is all of this important? Why are these statistics important? Why are you going through that? What does that truly have to do with the issue that we're here for today? I tell you that because courts have said that an area's propensity for criminal activity is something that may be considered with more particularized information when you are looking at reasonable suspicion. So those metrics that I just mentioned to you in slides 3 and 4 are metrics that a person who is policing properly, community policing, would know as they are going through and doing their job. Let's now take our focus to stay-at-home orders in place, and I'll move a little bit more rapidly through those. It's hard to believe that in the last 90 days how our world has changed, just only talking about the COVID-19 matter. So let's talk about these stay-at-home orders. March 13th was the first of the orders that came down, and that came from Governor McMaster, where he declared a state of emergency in South Carolina and suggested that COVID-19 posed an imminent threat to public health. March 15th, through an executive order, he closed all public schools in the state. That's an important factor, again, because the metrics will tell you that when school is out, crime rates, auto break-ins, property crimes tend to go up. Again, those are metrics that are explained and talked about on a daily basis, with officers. Let's look at the March 28th order, where an additional executive order came out, wherein Governor McMaster declared a state of emergency and declared that COVID-19 posed an actual risk to public health. Mayor Benjamin, on the next day, March 29th, issued an emergency order declaring that we needed to stay home and stay safe. Obviously, the North region is in the city of Columbia. So that stay home, stay safe order, in that stay home, stay safe order, Mayor Benjamin was asking individuals, telling individuals, ordering individuals to stay in their homes and to not travel, not to congregate, but to stay in their homes. Essentially, if you work, go to work, go home. We were not supposed to be on the streets. And there was an enforcement mechanism that was part of that actual order that suggested that any person who is in violation of that order could be found guilty of a misdemeanor. That order was in effect on April 8th. when this officer-involved shooting took place. To go even further, Governor McMaster issued a mandatory work or home order that was effective immediately. That took place actually on April 7th. The order was signed on the 6th. April 7th, it went into effect at 5 p.m. Obviously, about 25 hours before this situation took place. Again, shelter in place, stay at home. You are not supposed to be on the streets. If you run back in your minds, those of you who live in this area, you remember how empty the streets were at that point. That's because we were ordered to stay home. So a person moving along in the streets at that point in time, there could be reasonable suspicion based on other articulable facts. That could be reasonable suspicion to at least engage a person in a conversation. Again, there was an enforcement mechanism to that order as well. So I'm going to move on to this last portion before we get into some of the things that you actually are going to be more interested in taking a look at, I believe. Mr. Ruffin's actions when he encountered Officer Davis. That's reasonable suspicion. Those are things that constitute reasonable suspicion. This is what happened. Number one, when Officer Davis saw him in his marked police car, he ran behind the house on Arlington Street. That's Officer Davis drove up. Two, he reappeared farther down Arlington Street with a laptop type bag that was over his shoulder. Again, as I mentioned to you before, Officer Davis did not initially see that bag. Third, when asked if he could have a conversation with him, Mr. Davis walked away. Excuse me, Mr. Ruffin walked away from Mr. Davis. Fourth, Mr. Ruffin ignored Davis's request to speak with him. Fifth, he took off running down Arlington Avenue as he asked him to speak with him. It's at that point that Officer Davis got out of his vehicle and began to pursue him on foot. The commands to stop were ignored. As he's running, meeting Mr. Ruffin begins reaching for something in his waistband. And so, again, another city ordinance. If you refuse to stop upon an officer's command, that in itself, or when you knowingly fail to stop, you're in violation of city ordinance. So we're about to get into, again, the videos in just a moment. This is when the graphic material that I mentioned will be shown. So again, based on all of these circumstances, the question is, would a reasonable officer have believed that Mr. Ruffin had committed some type of crime? Would there be reasonable suspicion? And it's our belief that based on the totality of the circumstances, based on those particularized factors that I mentioned to you before, reasonable suspicion existed at that point.
Suspect is down. I shot. He had a gun in his hand. His gun's right by his hand, brother.
Now, I'll tell you, we're going to slow this video down a few times and show you from the same perspective, but just slowing down so you can see some of the things that the officer saw. So I'm not going to play that version. You're going to see it again, but you're going to see us enhancing some things so that you can see those things better. Now, I'm showing you here Columbia College Drive again, Timrod Street, and Arlington Street intersect here. So in this animation, what you're seeing, that blue dot is where obviously Officer Davis came in came in contact with Mr. Ruffin. Mr. Ruffin is represented by the yellow dot that's here. The path that they traveled as they entered on Oak Cliffs property, obviously you can see here. The distance that they traveled once Officer Davis exited his car was about 557 feet. Again, 557 feet. Pausing here to show you several factors here as I start to slow the video down. Number one, this is the point where we see Mr. Ruffin crouching, retrieving a .45 caliber pistol. That's also the first time that Officer Davis draws his weapon. Playing in real time, the first shot is fired after, which you'll see that gun is pointed and presented towards Officer Davis. We'll talk about use of force and what the law is as it relates to use of force in just a couple of moments. One of the things that you're not able to gather from body cam is the actual distance that a person is standing. So let me demonstrate that for you for a moment. Right here you have Deputy Solicitor April Sampson, Deputy Solicitor Dan Goldberg. They are 27 feet apart. That is the distance that Officer Davis was from Mr. Ruffin when he crouched down, or Mr. Ruffin crouched down to actually collect the pistol and point it at him. That's 27 feet, 8.49 meters. Actually, if you do the math, it's about 27.8 feet. So if you want a different vantage point, where I'm standing now and where the gentleman with the evidence camera is standing, that is 27 feet. So if I walk towards you, 4, 5, 6, 7, that's 27 feet from this second pew all the way back to this red line. That's the distance between them when Officer Davis saw the .45 caliber weapon that was pulled and pointed towards. So let's talk about use of force before I go and slow down a little bit more and show you a few more details. Officers can use deadly force to address an immediate or imminent threat of death or great bodily injury to either themselves or others. How do you determine if there's a threat that justifies using deadly force? The question here, and this is the major question, did the subject have the ability, the opportunity, and the intention to produce death or great bodily injury? Those three words, ability, opportunity, and intention. So let's talk about that a little bit more. Ability to produce death, great bodily harm. It's our contention that Mr. Ruffin did, because Mr. Ruffin had a gun in his hand. There's the ability to produce great bodily harm or even death. 2, was there an opportunity? It's our contention, yes, he did, because he was in close enough proximity to Mr. Davis, meaning 27 feet that I just walked out for you on either side. Mr. Ruffin was in close proximity to Officer Davis when he brandished that .45 caliber weapon. 3rd, was it his intention, meaning Mr. Ruffin's intention, to produce great bodily harm or even death? And quite frankly, we cannot tell you exactly what his intentions were. But what we can tell you is that he was armed, he pointed the gun at an officer, and he tried to evade an officer. So the question is, was it reasonable for Officer Davis to perceive Mr. Ruffin's intentions as hostile based on Mr. Ruffin's own actions? It's our contention that the answer to that question is yes. He reaches while running. Mr. Ruffin reaches for something in his waistband. He stops to bend down. He retrieves his gun, and he presents this weapon towards Mr. Davis. Then takes off running with his gun in his hand. So now, I'll show you a slower version. If you look here at the top of the screen, you see slowly Mr. Ruffin retrieving his gun. At the top of the screen. I'll do it one more time, and then there are more events I want you to see them in just a moment. Again, slower motion. Gun.